Thank you everyone for joining this webinar with Joy Matthews-Lopez from JML Testing Services. The title of the webinar is Accreditation, Certification, and Certificates, Credentialing in the New Workforce. Joy is one of the industry experts when it comes to accreditation of certifications and certificates. This webinar will be a great introduction to that topic if you're not familiar with it, and those of you who are even familiar with it will be able to pick up some best practices and hear some discussion on the future. So I hope you all enjoy that. So we'll start off with here an introduction of Joy. I've known Joy for about 20 years now. We worked together at Prometric as psychometricians years ago, and I learned a lot from working with her then. We stayed in contact. And she partners with assessment systems. She has her own company, JML, which I'll let her talk about here in a second too as she introduces herself. We greatly enjoy working with her, and I'm looking forward to this webinar. So Joy, let's start by introducing yourself.
Thanks, Nate. Good morning, and thanks for inviting me to do this. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Joy Matthews-Lopez. I am a senior psychometrician, and I own JML Measurement and Testing Services. And I'm really pleased to be here with you today.
Well, thank you. So the first question I had up was, go ahead.
No, you go, Nate.
First question I had lined up was asking to start by telling us how you got into the world of psychometrics and certification in particular.
Oh, all right. Well, I completed my master's in applied mathematics and statistics many, many years ago. And along the way, I taught pre-calculus, trigonometry, calculus 1, calculus 2, and courses, similar courses at different colleges and universities. And one day I decided to return to school to complete coursework to become a licensed teacher. The first course I took was in educational measurement, and it was love at first sight. For me, it was like combining peanut butter and chocolate. It was coupling my math background, my love of teaching, and then this new thing that I was learning about educational assessment or educational measurement, and it was simply magic for me. I immediately got out of that program, applied for the PhD program, and the rest is history. My first real job was in test adaptation, and that eventually became the area of my dissertation. I was hired by Educational Testing Service, ETS, to work in research and teacher licensure. So that's actually the answer to your question. This all started in licensure, teacher licensure. From there, I moved on to certification, back into licensure, back into certification, and this pinged back and forth until I had the wonderful opportunity to learn about assessment-based certificate programs, and then later accreditation. I had the honor of serving on the NCCA Commission for 6 years. I was chair of the commission for 2 years. And that gave me the opportunity to apply all the knowledge, skills, and abilities that I had acquired along the way to fit into the accreditation space. So that's what brings me to this point today.
Okay, thank you. Those of you who aren't familiar with the NCCA Commission, we'll be talking about that in a little bit, because that's an important topic to talk about. But we'll start first with, what is certification, and like how would you compare it to licensure or assessment-based certificates? What are some of the defining features of those?
Interesting, sure. So, when we talk about certification, are we talking about the certifying bodies, the organizations that offer certification programs, or are we talking about the candidates that are seeking certification? And so the answer to the question kind of depends on which angle that we're coming from. In general, certification is a designation, or it results in a designation or status that indicates an individual's attainment of a certain level of competence or some sort of specialty area. Obtaining certification typically requires successfully completing or meeting several requirements, such as an eligibility requirement for certification or some type of competency testing. Eligibility usually consists of a combination of education and experience, and that's established by the certifying body, the organization that's hosting the certification. And depending on the certification program, eligibility may also be required, may require some form of licensure, such as with medical doctors or pharmacists or certain types of therapists or nurses. Think board certification. So the two things are different in terms of certification versus licensure. The main difference between the two is one is licensure is typically mandated, whereas certification is typically not mandated. And I put the word typically there on purpose because in some places, certification can actually be required. In some states, it's written into the state bylaws that certification is required to practice. So that always depends on the context, but in general, what separates or differentiates licensure from certification is whether or not it's mandated. It's not the rigor, it's not necessarily the stakes, it's whether it's mandated.
Yeah, that's a good point, because when I originally got involved in this, I thought like licensure might be higher because it's mandated, but
Right.
there's things like driver's license exams or something where the effort that goes in developing those is a lot less than a lot of certification exams.
Right, right. I think the takeaway point here is how high the stakes are and what the whole point is. And the point is public safety. It's protecting the end users, the ultimate stakeholders, the public. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about a cosmetologist or we're talking about a plumber, we're talking about a board certified surgeon, we're talking about a pilot, anyone who has these add-on credentials, whether it's licensure, which isn't really an add-on, or it's certification. The point is that the purpose behind either of those, or for both of those, is protecting the public and ensuring that the people that are performing the duties and the tasks know what they're doing, that they really have demonstrated a certain level of proficiency and competence. And so we sometimes refer to this area of work as competency testing. And so yeah, that's really what we're talking about when we talk about certification or these types of credentials.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point there about protecting the public there too. This is a good example of where assessment is doing a public service. It's a public good. You don't want incompetent surgeons running around or anything like that. An incompetent nail technician or cosmetologist like that is a little different level of stakes than a surgeon or something like that, but it's still the same idea. And assessment often gets a bad rap in the media in some cases, but this is a case where assessment is doing us a public service.
Absolutely. And keep in mind that right now we are being US centric. Right now, this is where we're hosting. This is our target audience. This is who we're talking to. But we're not the whole world. And as we look outside these US borders, right now, our universities, as students graduate from colleges and universities or whatever career path they're taking, there's always there's this process of to ensure that people are really trained, and which is what we're doing with licensure and certification. But if you go outside the US, things are different, especially if you look in academia, colleges and universities. Just because you graduate from a college here doesn't mean that you're licensed. But in some places, when you graduate from college, the actual name of the degree, for example, in Latin America, is a licenciado, meaning literally a licensed one. And so the concept of licensure, certification, it doesn't exist. It's very different. And so when people ask, so what do you do? It's usually because I'm flying somewhere, and my answer is, well, we're flying right now. Wouldn't you like to think that your pilot, regardless of the airline, regardless of the country, regardless of the training, is really competent to fly the plane? And so what I do is work on the science side of making sure that people in these high stakes positions really have the necessary knowledge, skills, and abilities to do their job and to keep us safe. So I don't want to just think of it in terms of US. This is really, it's a small planet, and licensure and certification is relevant no matter where you're at and what the job is.
That's a great example. So another type of credential is an assessment-based certificate, which has only been around, well, I suppose they've been around for a long time, but it's gotten a lot more attention in the last 5 years. How would you define that and how it differs from certification?
Great question. So it's unfortunate that the name is a certificate, because I think people confuse it with certification. And these assessment-based certificates, or ABCs as they're known by their acronym, they're a different beast. And I love working with them. Let me explain what the fundamental differences are between, for example, certification. I'll even back up. Differences between licensure and certification whether or not they're mandatory. The rigor is the same. The steps to develop them are the same. The steps needed to maintain them are the same. All of that, they're almost interchangeable in terms of the workflow and the resources needed to support them. And then come along certificate programs. So I'm going to compare certificate programs to certification. Certification is about the job. It's about the profession. And when we go in to assess for certification, remember there was eligibility requirements, and then there's this assessment component. It's really assessing over all of the KSAs, the knowledge, skills, abilities, and the tasks that you perform as a professional. But in a certificate program, it's a different creature in that all the assessment, and there is a summative assessment, it is linked specifically to a course or to a set of learning materials. And that's different than certification. Certification is about the profession. Anything and everything you would need to do regardless of your practice setting. If you're a pharmacist, it doesn't matter if you are in a box pharmacy or you work in a long-term care facility or you're in a hospital or you own your own pharmacy. The KSAs are the same. However, in a assessment-based certificate program, the primary difference is that there's a course, a specific course. So when we talk about the content in certification, it's the assessment content. But when we talk about the content for an ABC, you have to qualify. Is it the learning content, the learning materials, or is it the assessment side of the house? So there is a course. We design the course. We define the content of the course. The course can have a little bit of breadth or it can be very narrow. It's usually a very specific target, very, very specific. It's not a large general area such as certification. And once that's in place, and whatever means you take to establish the breadth and the depth of the learning materials, the outcome of that are the learning objectives. And based on those learning objectives, we develop the assessment content and the items, the questions, test questions associated with this program, whatever we're developing, link directly to the learning objectives. And that's the content validity piece for these ABCs, is that linkage between the learning materials, the learning objectives, and the items that are written to those learning objectives. So as forms are assembled in certification and licensure, we're looking at the blueprints. In ABCs, we do look at blueprints, but the blueprints are phrased in terms of learning objectives. It's all about the course material and the linkage between them, that alignment. So I wish the word wasn't certificate, but it is. And these are ABCs, assessment-based certificate programs. What we get out of it is a certificate as opposed to certification. And again, what's the difference? The words sound the same. In certification, I carry my credentials as long as I maintain my certification. So whatever it is, an XYZ, I am an XYZ, and I have to maintain that, whether it's through retesting or through continuing education or whatever the requirements are that are established by the certifying body, the organization that sponsors and hosts the certification. In an ABC, it's a one and done deal. I have my credential, I list it maybe on my resume. It doesn't go behind my name as letters, my XYZ, but I have the training and I can show that it was more than just showing up. I actually had to take a course, and the ABC, or the assessment piece of it, it's kind of like a final exam, and I can list that I completed it successfully, but then that's it. That's the extent of the power of that ABC. Does that make sense, Nate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to come back to talking about the source of the blueprints, but we have our first question. I'm going to try to weave that in here. And any of the rest of you who are listening, if you have other questions, please drop them in the box and we'll try to answer all of them. So the first question is, does mandated also indicate issued by a government entity versus a commercial or association issued credential?
Yeah, it could go either way. So when there are times when let me back up. We're talking licensure or certification. So there are times that certification is also mandated. I have seen it written into state law. where a certification is a requirement to practice. In some states, for example, some types of therapists must hold certain credentials, and it's beyond license, where it's the specialization, it's their certification. And there are non-governmental agencies that might also require it, such as a hospital. A hospital may require that a certain percentage of their nurses hold certain certifications, just to demonstrate expertise and competency in certain specialty areas. Same thing for physicians. Sometimes, in order to have practicing privileges, hospital privileges, they have to be board certified in whatever their area of specialty is. So that's beyond licensure. So when we talk about something being mandated, it goes back to the old, it depends on, by whom, for what reason. So in general, licensure is required from a governmental agency. In some cases, certification is also required by a governmental agency, but it is typically not. It is typically, it typically has other applications.
Yeah, it can be really confusing here too, because there's other types of licenses too that aren't even assessment focused, like a marriage license. I remember when I got married, I had to go register for a marriage license, and I was just filling out a form, and it didn't even require the other person to be there. Like, technically, I could have registered with a marriage license for a supermodel, and like it would have been on the books, and that was all that was involved with the marriage license.
Point.
All right, so back to the point on the blueprints. You're talking about how the blueprints for the ABC is based upon the learning objectives. How does that differ from how we get the blueprints for certification?
It's going to depend on who you ask, but since you're asking me, I'll give you my particular answer. When I approach the development of an ABC, I treat it almost like certification. I start with a job task analysis. Starting with a job task analysis is not required by accreditation standards for all ABCs. It is for all certification programs. Licensure and certification, absolutely. Job task analysis, no fooling around. You need to actually document not only the process, but the rationale for the methodologies you use to define the scope, the depth, and the breadth for your credential. Now, what about ABCs? Well, it depends. And according to, and again, it's going to depend on which standards you're using, but in general, the standards, different standards will tell you it depends on the stakes of the ABC. There are some ABCs that are high stakes. There are some ABCs that are not high stakes. So depending on the rationale that you provide, you as the developer of the ABC, as to how you determine the stakes of your ABC, if you determine supported with your rationale that it's a high stakes ABC, you'll be required to conduct a job task analysis or the equivalent. So let's say we're going that path. So we have our job task analysis, whatever methodology we're going to use. And based on the outcomes of that job task analysis, the next step in the workflow is to validate those findings. Typically, a job task analysis, you can involve anywhere from 10 to 20 people on a committee. And that sounds like a lot of people, up to 20 people. That's like herding cats at times. So it sounds like a lot of people, but it doesn't when you talk across a profession or a target population. 20 is nothing. And so we need to validate. We ask other people, what do you think? Did we miss anything? Is there anything that we included that we shouldn't have included? And so based on the outcomes of the validation survey, and now we're talking hundreds, if not thousands of people responding to our validation survey, we then can analyze that response data, and depending on which analyses we use and the decisions we make as we conduct those analyses, we come up with a blueprint, the weights for the different content areas, whether we call them content domains or whatever words we use. The fact is, the final product is a roadmap on how to assemble our exam forms. This is true for licensure and certification and ABCs, but the ABC piece, you have to stop and pause there for a second And we need to, before we move into the assessment side, we now have our job task analysis. We've had a validation survey. We have a blueprint. And this is where we pause. And we look back at the other side of the house in terms of the learning materials. And we have to make sure that the learning materials accurately reflect what resulted from that job task analysis. And make sure that the blueprint is aligned with the learning materials and that the learning materials are aligned. It's a two-way street with the blueprint. And once we know that we're in lockstep between the course materials, the learning objectives, and the blueprint, now we're ready to write questions for our ABC. And as we develop those questions, if we're working in the certification world, we write items, whatever the item type is that the program has decided we're going to use. We include our rationales, we include our references. In an ABC, I'm not referring to references. I can point exactly to what line and what paragraph on which page in the learning materials that this question maps to. It is in this microcosm. It's very different because we're only asking questions based on the materials that we included in the course that's part of the ABC. So, Nate, to answer your question, do we come up with the blueprints any differently? No, it's a job task analysis to a validation survey, analyze the data, come up with our blueprint. But are they exactly the same between certification and ABCs? No, because in an ABC, we have to stop and pause and make sure that we're phrasing things in terms of learning objectives and that everything makes sense and is aligned with the learning materials. That's the fundamental difference between the certification blueprint and the ABC blueprint.
Thank you. That's a very informative answer. Now, earlier you mentioned another term that I think not all listeners might be familiar with. I think it's worth discussing too. What are eligibility requirements or eligibility pathways, and how do they relate to ABCs and certifications?
Great question. So eligibility requirements typically are a combination of educational requirements and something experiential. How many years of experience or types of experiences, and the certifying body, the organization that's sponsoring the credential. That body determines what the eligibility requirements are. In certification, it is almost always a combination of some educational component and an experiential component, almost always. I don't know that I've ever seen an exception to it. There could be, but there would have to be a rationale in place. I mean, there's always, that's the heart of credentialing, is providing rationales and explanations for the decisions we make. So in terms of eligibility requirements for certification, it is typically, if not always, some combination of something in terms of your educational training, and it could be that it has to be a 4-year, a degree from a 4-year accredited institution, but it might not be. It might be or equivalent. And again, it goes back to the sponsoring organization that determines it and puts the rationales in place, why this makes sense, why these are the prereqs for this certification. For an ABC, there are usually eligibility requirements, and it's going to depend on the program. I've seen eligibility requirements that are that you complete the application in a timely manner, that that you have at least 10 hours in the field, or it's, I don't want to say that the bar is not as high, because I don't want to demean ABCs. I have tremendous respect for them, but remember what the purpose of the ABC is. It's really just to come in the door, to take the course, and then to take the exam. And so it depends on whether or not, how the ABC is going to be used, what the scores or the outcomes, the pass-fail status, what the implications are, how people will use that information. So it depends on the course. It's very, sometimes ABCs are sponsored by universities. And it may be that the university requires you to be a registered student. That would be an eligibility requirement. There are universities that may not require you to be a registered, a regular student. So again, it depends on who's sponsoring it, what the program is all about, what the purpose of the ABC is. Another example, I live very near a university and I'm affiliated with a university, and they're trying to start a new certificate program in the College of Engineering for cement mixing. And this is very different than the courses they offer for the engineers, civil engineers in materials. This is very, very specific. It's just about mixing cement, different types of mixing, different types of materials, different temperature requirements, etc. And the reason for the course is to get summer interns ready before they go out for their internships. And they want to show that these students have very specialized training, that they took a very specific course on mixing cement, and that they were successful, that they passed the summative assessment. So it keeps going back to, it depends on the context. So in terms of eligibility requirements for this, these students needed to be registered, actively enrolled in the university. They had to be students in the College of Engineering. They needed to be in civil engineering in order to take the course. So it depends.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic example there, and something I want to get back to at the end as we talk about the future of credentialing, how I think higher education is going to move more in that direction, and that there's other things they can offer that as a university can offer as a product other than a 4-year degree. So they don't just have a 4-year general degree in marketing, they can also have ABCs in WordPress website management or social media marketing, and it's a very specific course, and you take a test, and you might have to be a student, you might not have to be a student in the 4-year degree to do those types of things. And I think that's going to have a big effect on how we train our next generation of workforce. We'll come back to that. So now we're halfway through. I'd like to switch from the certification, licensure, certificate to talking about accreditation. So start by talking about how you would define accreditation, and then we'll talk about the different ways to do it and what's involved.
Sure. So accreditation is a type of third-party verification that certain pre-established standards have been met. That's it. That's what it is. It means that it's not good enough that I say, we have a great program, here's how we developed it, we think it's fantastic. That's different than getting that seal of the good housekeeping seal of approval. And that's what accreditation is. It means that my program has been thoroughly vetted by a qualified third-party organization against a certain set of standards. There's not just one set of standards. There are many, many different sets of standards. And depending on what my program is about, there might be a certain set of standards that are more applicable to what I do. And so it's this idea of a third-party verification, a third-party vetting of my program from tip to tail to make sure that I'm consistent and aligned with the standards. This isn't to say that my program would be accredited under a different set of standards. It depends on the standards that we're applying to my review. So the standards in general, they're guidelines. They're guidelines or requirements. They're usually based on best known practices for whatever the intended purposes are. There's some common standards that most people will know of. Some are, one example would be from the National Commission on Certifying Agencies. That's the NCCA we spoke about earlier. They're the NCCA standards. There's also ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. ISO has a slew, just hundreds and hundreds of different standards, depending on, are we trying to certify people? Are we trying to certify products? We're trying to certify processes. So it depends on what the program is and what the purpose of the program is. We also have educational standards. We've got AERA, APA, and CME standards, and I know that's 3 sets of acronyms. They are put out, the name are the standards for educational and psychological testing. And this set of standards, they serve primarily as guidelines for anyone involved in educational assessment in terms of fairness, validity, processes, just to give us guidelines and a compass so that people are applying best known practices. Let me think. I should also mention that there are organizations that serve, I don't want to call it as a middleman, but they have assessors that will apply standards that they don't own and to programs. And so they serve as the people that check that alignment. And we've heard of ANSI, for example. And ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, that's ANSI, they serve this role. There's another IAS that serves this role. That's the International Accreditation Service. And they will help you, they'll check the alignment between your program and whatever standards that are applicable to your program. It's usually an ISO, one of the ISO standards. So what is accreditation? It's this third-party verification that your program is in alignment and conforms with the requirements for the standards that are being applied, that you have requested be applied to your program. That's what accreditation is.
You made an important point earlier in that it's important to understand that accreditation is not something specific to the world of exams. Like there's accreditation for scientific research labs, for factories in terms of their quality processes, just everything under the sun can be accredited. But in the world of exams here that we're talking about today, accreditation means specifically how you develop your exam. Does it align with the EARA, APA, SME standards, or other types of standards around what makes a good quality exam? What are the right pathways to have in terms of the eligibility requirements we had? There's all these types of things. So that's my next question. What are the types of things that go into getting accreditation for a certification program? I mean, it's not just the exam, right?
It's not just the exam. And let me back up to the one we were just talking about. Remember, even colleges and universities or schools, they can be accredited. They're not necessarily accredited, or their programs are accredited. A university can have some programs that are accredited and some that are not accredited. So it's not even just people or products. There are also programs that can be accredited by the same arguments. So yes, there's a lot more that goes into, let's focus on certification, for example, in terms of accreditation than just the test. Remember the eligibility requirements? When we talk about eligibility, it's not eligibility necessarily to sit for the test. It's eligibility for certification. And so one of the components that an accreditation group will look at is what are your eligibility requirements and what are the rationales to justify these. We don't want to see roadblocks put in place, unnecessary roadblocks that would impact fairness. And so there has to be some rationale and justification. But well beyond that, what kind of NDAs do you have in place, and with whom do you have your non-disclosure agreements? Is it only with candidates? Or what about vendors? And what about any people that handle your test materials? Accreditation is it's a 360 review. And so what about conflicts of interest? How have you vetted people in your system to make sure that there are no conflicts of interest, or that you've identified and contained them? So you have firewalls where you need to have firewalls. What's your process? How do you develop your assessment from soup to nuts? How do you develop this? How do you develop your assessment component? How did you do your job task analysis? What was your methodology, and why did you use that particular methodology? How was it appropriate for your program? You've decided to use 4-option multiple choice questions. That's fine. You can do what you want, but you have to have a justification. What's your rationale? Why do you believe that 4-option multiple choice questions will adequately be able to assess the necessary KSAs for your credential? Maybe there's a performance component to your assessment. There's the written component. Think of the driver's license test. I mean, you test me over the rules of the road. Do I know what to do when I come to a four-way stop? Whatever the rules are. But you also take me on a driving test. I actually have to drive the car. Just because I know the rules doesn't mean that I can apply that knowledge. And so there are programs that have a performance component to it as well. Some do, some don't. But even then, how did I standardize what the prompts were? You know, the driving instructor or the assessor has me turn left after 3 blocks, but someone else taking the test, maybe they turned right 2 blocks away. Making a right-hand turn might require a different set of, different KSAs than making a left-hand turn. Maybe someone was taken on the driving route that has less traffic versus more traffic, or has traffic lights versus no traffic lights. So what did I do in my program to make sure that it was fair, depending on, which person is reviewing me? Are there multiple raters? Was there just one person in the car watching me, or were there three people in the car watching me? What kind of scoring rubric do I have in place for scoring my performance-based test? How do I determine what the reliability of my assessment instruments are? How often do I develop content, and what process do I use to develop test questions? Do I vet those questions? I'll throw a tasty treat out for Nate here. Am I using artificial intelligence to do any of these things? To develop my content, or to assemble my forms, to automate any of my analyses? Am I using AI to help with my job task analysis and doing background research as I go into my JTA meeting? So everything that's involved, everything that is involved in bringing people in, testing them, how I test them, how I proctor them, how I analyze resulting data, how I protect their personal information. Everything I do, my policies, my procedures, how often do I review content to make sure it's current? How often do I run my JTAs to make sure that I'm assessing over the right domain of information? Everything I do is subject to review during the accreditation process. So all of that narrative was simply to say everything. Everything is reviewed during the accreditation process. Everything. And the secret, if there is such a secret to navigating the accreditation process, I'll go back and say secrets. Let me put an S on it. Have a plan. Make sure that the plan makes sense. Execute the plan as the plan was written. Put the rationales and explanations in place. Have the right policies and procedures that make sense for your program, and to keep everything current. Those are the secrets for navigating accreditation. Do what you say you're going to do it well, and document it. Everything needs to be documented, and even that documentation needs to have a certain cadence to it. There has to be a certain system. Have your own library where you have all of your documentation in a way that you can get your hands on it and that it all makes sense. So what does it take to achieve accreditation? A lot of organization. It takes a lot of resources. You have to show that you have enough resources. Your program will not be accredited if it's just a one-person shop, because one person can't do all of this. It would be only 24 hours in the day. It would take too much work. So what does it take to achieve accreditation? You have to have a plan. You have to execute the plan and have the resources to execute the plan and to maintain the program. I once worked with a program where all the resources were focused on building the certification, and they just weren't thinking long term. Once you build it, what do you do with it? You have to maintain it. And so I was always the pest on the side of the room saying, but how are you going to maintain that? How are you going to maintain that? Because certificants, people who go through your program and are awarded their certification, they are required to maintain their certification. So what are you going to do to maintain the program so that they can maintain their certification? And so it takes planning. It takes having a good, solid, defensible plan, executing the plan, having the resources to support the plan, and to be able to document the plan. That's what it takes.
Yeah, and it's important to understand for NCCA, not even all of the requirements are around the assessment. Like you have to have that same level of documentation around bylaws, committee meetings, audited financial statements, all of these other things that go into making sure that your organization is legit. It's not just, okay, did we write some good test questions, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's why people that are interested in getting accredited as a certification need to understand that it's not just a one-man job, like you said. It is a lot of work when you're talking about legal things, audited financial statements from a professional CPA. So many other things go into just saying you have a good test.
It is a long-term commitment. It's not a short-term gig. Accreditation is a long-term commitment because once you build it and people come, and they will come, you have the obligation to maintain the program. And so it's a long-term commitment, and it has to be reflected in the mission of the organization. It has to be reflected in the mission. It has to be reflected in the financials. There has to be financial commitment to maintain and sustain the program.
Yeah. Another important thing is we talk about the firewall between certification and education staff, so that people who are involved in education, such as writing training programs or making courses, they can't be the ones also running the certification exam, right?
Correct. And we don't want any conflicts of interest. And I'll go a step beyond that. We don't want any perceived conflicts of interest. It has to look clean. It has to just be clean, but it also has to look clean. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Now we talked earlier about NCCA and ISO, ANSI, ANAB. How do those two differ, and how might you choose one versus the other for your organization?
Well, that's a tricky one. So typically, and I just have to keep prefacing things with typically, because there's always an exception. But and I am an absolute fan of NCCA standards. That's where I put my stake. That's where I've invested in my clients, and I'm really a fan of the standards. I think they're fantastic. But are they different? So we've got, let's make just a two-way comparison. We've got NCCA standards, and let's say we're looking at ISO 17024, which is for the certification of personnel, of people. So they result in the same product, so we can compare apples to apples. And what's the difference? Well, ICE, that owns the NCCA side of the house, whereas you mentioned ANSI. ANSI is a different party, a different organization that has assessors that apply. They do the same thing that the NCCA commissioners do, but they do them to ISO 17024. So the real question is about the NCCA standards as opposed to the ISO 17024. That's the actual comparison. And what's the difference? They're just two different sets of standards. Basically, they're going to ask the same questions. They're going to look at the same issues. They may look at them and use different words or come at them with different lenses, but they ultimately are looking for the integrity of the programs. And they're going to be looking pretty much at the same things. So what's the difference between them? NCCA tends to have a North American focus. That's not to say they don't have international programs. They absolutely have programs that test around the world, test in different languages, absolutely. But in terms of recognition, the perception from the client side is that NCCA tends to be a North American process or a thing. Whereas ISO, just the I in it is international, is internationally recognized. Even when I'm working with a client and I know they're going to be seeking accreditation to ISO 17024, and I know the standards that will be applied to their program. And so I know exactly how to phrase the documentation. I know how to title things so that when it comes time for their review, everything will go smoothly. I still, in my heart of hearts, in my psychometric mind, I still apply the NCCA standards, because to me, those psychometric standards are the gold standard. They are, the rigor is there, they make sense, the flow is right. And so I know that if I meet from my side all of the NCCA requirements, I know that the program will go through in terms of the technical review for ISO 17024. But that really wasn't your question. Your question was, what's the difference between the two? And the answer is two different organizations own them. That's the difference. Okay. But at the end of the day, it's the same rigor is required. ISO 17024 language tends to be less technical in terms of psychometrics. You don't see that word in the standards. You don't see psychometricians being called in. However you want to create your validity argument, go for it. If you can establish it without a psychometrician, power to you. But on the NCCA side of the house, if they believe that you had no psychometric support in your program, pretty sure you'd have a hard time justifying that. And I agree with them. You should have a psychometrician on a high stakes program. But the actual answer to the question is, what's the difference between two sets of standards? It's who owns them. The rigor is going to be the same. The requirements are going to basically be the same. And the level of what they have to establish as they map to the standards, it's going to be the same.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. Then we'll move to some follow-up questions here, but I want to remind the attendees to put any questions in the chat there if you have any that you'd like to ask us to talk about before we conclude. But my next question then is, how will credentialing grow or evolve as you see it as we move into the whole gig economy and traditional higher education becomes less important, as we have less four-year degrees and more ABCs or potential other ways of getting skills and entering the workforce?
Yeah, it's a great question. 3 of my clients right now are different universities, and we're creating ABCs. And I don't know that the university degrees are going to become less important. I just believe they're going to play a different role and they're going to serve a different purpose. But I do see the universities are recognizing that these ABCs are a good idea in that they, number one, are an additional revenue stream. Number two, they attract students from a different perspective. And number three, it's very good marketing for them because they've got students with hands-on applied skills going into their internships, for example. Back in the olden days, when you went to college, you had your major and you might have a minor. These ABCs are forming a new niche in that wall. And they are very focused. They're very specific. The one that I'm working on is about quantum computing. And so they're having for eligibility requirements that students have to take this course, but it belongs to such and such department, which is a different college within the university. They have to have this course, but that's at a different department and yet a different college. Think college engineering versus colleges of arts and sciences under the umbrella of a university. And so it's a mechanism to be able to pull courses across colleges within a university. And so an eligibility requirement is that they take these courses, and that meets the educational component. And then we have the assessment piece in there. So they're creating these almost hybrid ABCs to serve a very to fill this void, because it's not really a minor per se. Minors usually live within a college, but these are across colleges within a university. Another way they're using them is to prepare students and make sure that they have real hands-on experience before going out to work. Kind of like the driver's test. Yes, I can take the course, I can read the book, I can master everything that's in the book, but it doesn't mean I can drive a car or a bus or a semi-truck. You need to see me in the seat behind the wheel doing that. And these ABCs that universities are using these days, that they're building and using, are giving students the opportunity to have hands-on practical experience and to demonstrate mastery over certain skills, application of certain abilities and knowledge prior to going into a certain environment. And so I foresee ABCs growing and growing and growing, and not just in the universities. I see it in companies. A client that you and I both have in common, Nate, is really producing not only their own certification exams, but they're now producing these spin-off ABCs, and quite a few of them, so that they can show that their different types of employees have very specific hands-on skills. And so I don't see these going away, whether we call them micro credentials or we call them ABCs. And yes, there's a nuanced difference there. I see these are around to stay, and they're going to grow. I believe they're going to grow as big as certification is in our field right now. They're on the move. I get, I don't know, easily on average 2 inquiries a week about building an ABC. They're on the move.
Wow. Okay, thank you. We had one question come in. Can you speak to talking about credentialing for trades occupations? You know, how might that be different than the occupations that are more healthcare, finance, or otherwise come from a university level?
Like I was just mentioning, a client that you and I have in common, they're not an academic institution. It's a large corporation, and they are actively, they're real believers in assessment-based programs, and they want to make sure that their employees have the right hands-on skills and that those skills are current. And so they're requiring employees to take these ABCs because they can control the narrative, they control the content. The tools are company specific. So if it's I'll make up an example. Let's say that it's an engineering organization, then maybe there's certain equipment or certain tools, certain processes, certain offices that where information is stored, where they have to access. And so it's a way of making sure that even though I have the academic credential to be hired, it doesn't mean that I have the hands-on experience. And so they can control the narrative. And this is not an academic institution. And actually, most ABCs are not in academic institutions right now. Most of them are in these independent, large organizations. I've seen this in banking, hands-on. I've worked with a group in the banking industry where they want to make sure that where one bank buys another bank, how do I make sure that an accountant one here is an accountant one there? And the way they're doing it is with ABCs. That this is the course for accountant ones. I know you're an accountant one, you've been one for 4 years, but you still have to take this ABC and demonstrate proficiency. And so that way they can standardize their positions, they can standardize their job descriptions. It helps with their assessment process as they assess their employees. And it just makes it the risk management people within these large companies love the ABCs because it provides them definitive evidence that they were doing their due diligence to keep their employees trained and current as the field changes. So this is not just universities by any means. They're the exception. It's these private entities that are really moving with ABCs.
Okay, thank you. And then last final question that's been on everybody's mind, and it's not an easy one, and there's many ways to think about it, is how is AI going to impact the world of credentialing? And I know it's part going to affect the item development, test development process, the delivery process, worrying about cheating, how training is going to work. What are your thoughts on that?
Just came back from EATP and in Berlin just a few days ago, and the whole conference was about AI. It was fascinating to listen to the different speakers, different perspectives, different applications, different practice settings, and how AI is being used, what's working, what's not working, and where does the human component need to come into play. I believe, because you asked me the question, so I get to answer, I believe that AI will impact credentialing in just about every way, from preparing to go into a job task analysis to conducting those validation surveys, generating base content or our items. I think we're going to see this in terms of AI is going to come in to assemble our test forms, at least make the first draft, then the humans come in behind them. So it's not just generating content, assembling test forms, automating our item analyses. That's been automated for years and years, but AI is going to bring a different perspective on a different level into this. Scoring, reporting, proctoring, scheduling, it's going to touch every aspect. That said, I want to put the emphasis on the human element here, whether it's an accredited program or you're trying to, you want to copyright your items. When AI comes in, make sure that it's in a controlled way, it's intentional use, and that there's a plan. You know what you're doing, you know how to use the tools, and that there's the roadmap, the plan has the human element woven in at the right places for again, to meet certain requirements, but to also remember who's running the show. And at minimum, AI does what we ask it to do. And so here we just need to be intentional in our uses and our applications, and we have to keep the goal in sight. And that goal is great measurement, defending our programs, defending the integrity of those programs, so that at the end of the day, it's good measurement, it's great measurement. That we say a pass has a meaning, failing has a meaning, and be able to interpret and apply the outcomes of our work. I believe AI is here to stay. It's going to touch just about every part of the process, and we need to use it responsibly and stay on top of it. But it's here to stay, and it's going to touch every aspect.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree. And the key is how we're going to put guidelines around it and make sure what part still is human controlled.
Agreed.
Okay, well, thank you. We've come to the end of the hour here. So I just want to end up with any closing remarks you might have, and how people can get in touch with you if they'd like to work with you as a consultant on developing a certification or an ABC.
Oh, well, thank you for the opportunity. This has really been fun. I like talking about this stuff, and so this has just been a fun hour for me. If anyone wants to reach out, you can reach out through Nate. You can reach me through him. You can reach me at joy@assess.com or at joy@jmltesting.com, and I'd be happy to respond to you. I didn't do this to drum up business. I really just wanted to join the conversation, to share my years of experience and what I've learned. And it's also just fun to talk about this stuff. So if I can be of help, reach out. And if you have follow-up questions, that's fine too. I would be happy to answer your questions. Thanks, Nate, for this opportunity. It was very kind of you to invite me.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been extremely informative. This is exactly what I would have needed my first year out of grad school, when I had all the academic training on psychometrics, but I didn't understand all of these other terms about the business of assessment. So thank you very much for the great conversation. And I look forward to having you on future episodes, hopefully.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.